Hello and welcome to this interview for theheadlineact.com. I'm Daniel Seed. Today's guest is actor, visual artist and author of his latest book, Questionable Deeds. Questionable Deeds chronicles the sudden passing of Michael's partner Jono in 2004 and highlights the very real impact Australia's marriage inequality can have socially, economically and emotionally. This interview was filmed at the University of Queensland in September 2015. Michael, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure.
Yesterday you found out that your new book, Questionable Deeds, had hit the #1 spot on Amazon in the LGBT biographies and memoir section.
Yep.
And it's even beat out a book about Ellen DeGeneres. That must be a big moment for you.
It is, it's very good. It's very good. Nothing against Ellen, but she probably doesn't need the publicity.
No. So can you talk a bit about how you came to self-publish the book? And given the sales on Amazon, does that vindicate your decision to go ahead with self-publishing it?
Yes, it does. I think it's. I wouldn't have predicted getting into those lists so fast, and I really wasn't aware of their existence. But a writer friend, sort of pointed them out to me, and I had a look, sort of creep up. But it's been at #1 for the last few days, which is great. So yes, so someone who just sort of threw the gauntlet down and decided just to go ahead and publish, despite trying to find a traditional publisher. Yeah, it's great. It's a fantastic result.
So onto the book. The book begins with the very sudden passing of your partner Jono in 2004, and that ultimately became the start of a very protracted period of grief for you. Can you briefly outline for people who haven't read the book what happened in those couple of months after he passed away?
Well, Jono died very suddenly, so it was a total shock. We were about 2 weeks away from opening a production that he had directed and was choreographing and was appearing in. So suddenly life just took an enormous U-turn. Not just hitting the brakes, it was just kind of like a car crash in a way. So when people die, of course, you go through the motions of a funeral ceremony, and then eventually you have to sort of reach the point of wrapping up their affairs. And so a few weeks went by, and I was due to be in receipt of his death certificate because I was the client in the funeral contract between me and the funeral directors. But I started to notice that things weren't running particularly smoothly. There was a delay in getting his death certificate, and I initially thought that was because there was no cause of death found. So I sort of let things slide a little bit, and then in the process of thinking about having to potentially move, I realised that there was some stuff going on which just wasn't particularly pleasant in terms of money and rental agreements and our utility accounts, and before I knew it, I realised there was a great big problem, and that was his family.
So the book, if I was going to sum it up in one sentence, it really comes down to the death certificate. If that death certificate was produced accurately in the first place, we wouldn't be talking today.
Yes, yes.
And then there was just 6 words in the Marriage Act, which were between a man and a woman, that mean we are talking today.
Yes.
Because without them, Jono's family couldn't have done what they did with the death certificate. Do you think that the broader marriage equality debate is effectively communicating that these sorts of issues could arise in a very practical way?
You mean the negative issues?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
The legal issues with, say, accessing the superannuation and that sort of stuff.
One of the reasons why so many Australian people want marriage equality is because of the situation I found myself in, and we call that an emergency or a crisis. So the sudden death of someone or the incapacitation of your partner can create these issues between blood relatives and a family, in that a family being a de facto unit of 2 people of opposite gender or the same gender. So some of us, and I include myself in this, we just want a stronger legal protection, because yes, if Jono and I had had a marriage certificate, even though there was no legal course to get married in 2004 when he died, but if we had, the problems I encountered would have been probably annoying, but they wouldn't have been disenfranchising. I wouldn't have been kept away from important documents and had to sort of really claw back the elements of my life that I needed to in the wake of his death. So yes, marriage is required for many people because of that, but there's also many other reasons. There's the emotional reason, there's the spiritual reason, there's also just the plain simple fact that inequality is inequality. People want access to a way to solemnise a marriage. It could just be for a symbolic reason. I mean, marriage is the strongest symbol of relationship that we have in Australia. Whether you like that or not, it's the strongest symbol of it. So some people just want access to it because of that. They like to make a statement about their relationship. I can see that point, but from my perspective, what I'm seeking is a strong legal protection.
So after changing the death certificate without your knowledge, Jono's family denied not only not knowing about your relationship, but also denied knowing that he was gay before he passed away.
Yes.
And this is even after, as you say later in the book, that you even spoke to one of his previous partners who had had dealings with the family.
Yes.
It must be near impossible to see that not only someone denying that the relationship existed, but that people are actually believing that.
Yes, it is. It was quite startling, and I have to add that it was short term. It was, as best I can guess, and you see this in the book, it was a short term attempt to explain perhaps why they were in the process of doing what they were doing. So at one moment I was told that they were denying the existence of relationship, denying the fact that they knew he was gay. By the end of that day, they'd changed their tune, which was sort of, that's why I describe it as like a tactic. It was just a changed approach to litigation that was just unfolding before my eyes. It was very, very fast, that process. And yes, ultimately I did get to meet Jono's first partner and to come to terms with the fact that it would probably, what happened to me could probably have happened to anyone in the position that I was in. It helped me realise that it wasn't about me, it was just about the person in that position at that time. So it did help ultimately to come to terms with it a bit more.
When you did get a copy of the death certificate, it was a photocopy, it was crumpled up and it was wrong in several sections. You later burned that copy with a friend. That must have been a heartbreaking discovery when you saw that.
It was very mean-spirited, and I received it because I had just been asking for it, kindly, gently, respectfully, asking for what was my right, and that was to see the death certificate that had been created. And in the end, the only way I got that was because I had a lawyer at that time, and we made that request, hoping that we would get what's called a full original death certificate, one that I could make use of, even though my name wasn't on it. At least I could warrant that Jono had died to important third parties like banks and that sort of thing. When the photocopy came through, I saw it in my lawyer's office, and it was just literally a photocopy that looked like it had been sort of crumpled. Maybe that was the post, I don't know. But it felt incredibly mean-spirited, incredibly unfair and unjust and unequal. And of course I could see at that point that there was very important details missing, like the fact that he had been in a relationship when he died, so he was listed on that interim death certificate as single. It also had anomalies about his career. I described that photocopied death certificate as the perfect death certificate for him had he died in 1985, 20 years before he did actually die. So it needed to be fixed. And part of me just couldn't rest until that was fixed, and it did take some time to actually get that all fixed.
You say in the book that you and Jono were blissfully unaware of your legal status. The earliest protection that you had was the Property Relationships Amendment Act, that essentially meant that you could be seen as a de facto couple, that you could act for each other in certain legal matters, and importantly, in the case of intestacy, as it was here, where Jono died without a will. Following this were changes to the superannuation laws that were enacted just in time for you.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about that?
There was a bill before Parliament, Federal Parliament in 2004, which was tabled on the 27th of May that year, and Jono died on the 31st of that month. And in hindsight, I realised that I only was able to access his superannuation death benefit by the grace of that very short number of days. And it took a long period of time to actually realise that, because the legislation was changing before our eyes. The customer service staff at his superannuation company were incredibly helpful. They were one of the most up-to-speed groups on the current legislation, because, as I said, it was
And they were actually the ones that advised you of the changes, weren't they?
They were, yeah, they were great, and they gave me a lot of hope, whereas in many other circumstances, like with the New South Wales Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages and certain other government organisations and utility companies, there was just this big grey area about who was Jono's next of kin at the point of his death. The New South Wales state law told us that that was me, but it was actually getting people to understand that, getting organisations to come to terms with that when there was another energy in play, and that was someone else, in this case his mother, who was claiming that she was his next of kin at that point.
In 2007, we saw the Same-Sex, Same Entitlements report from the Human Rights Commission,
Yes.
and that report showed a multitude of federal legislation in regards to workplace entitlements, tax, superannuation, that sort of stuff, that were not available to same-sex couples. This changed under the Howard government, who were also the government that changed the Marriage Act to exclude those couples. How did we get to that weird point of purgatory where they're changing, I think you said it was over 100 pieces of legislation in the end, and yet there was the one that they made a conscious effort to go the other direction?
It's a very good question, how we got to that anomaly of law. I don't know, it probably took a very long time to get to that point. But the linchpin in changing it was Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd took that report that the Human Rights Commission had created in 2006. They presented it to Parliament in 2007, and at that time the Prime Minister was John Howard and the Attorney General was Philip Ruddock. Now they didn't act on any of the recommendations in the report that the Human Rights Commission had created, and they identified about 70 pieces of legislation that needed changing. So Kevin Rudd made it into an immediate election promise for the 27 election. And he said that within 100 days of becoming Prime Minister, he would do an audit of those pieces of legislation. And of course, as we know, he won, and he was true to his word. He did audit those, and he found that there was actually more like 100 pieces of legislation that discriminated against gay and lesbian people financially. That's what the report had been about. And this is everything from as you say, certain superannuation laws, but also very important ones for people in the position I found myself in, because Centrelink did not currently at that time recognise same-sex relationships, de facto relationships. So I wasn't able to access any kind of support benefits for the process of being a widow, and whereas a straight couple in my position, or a straight surviving spouse in my position, would have been able to access that without question. So it made it incredibly difficult to struggle on during grief, to earn a living, having to move, etc., etc. I mean, I was very lucky. I was able to actually get through that with help, with support from family and friends. I changed tack a bit work-wise, but it would have been much better if I hadn't had to face that stuff. And certainly straight couples or straight surviving spouses didn't at that time have to worry about ongoing employment. There was sort of a grace period that the benefit system allowed. So Kevin Rudd changed all that, but he didn't bring us quite as far as a lot of the lobbyists wanted, and that was to create some kind of solemnisation of relationships. There was some pressure on Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard to embrace civil unions at a federal level, but there really was not a great enthusiasm to take that up, and before we knew it, we got the period that we all know about, the revolving door of leadership, which is still going, and marriage equality or civil unions for gay and lesbian people has just been swallowed up in the power struggles that are to do with that.
Do you think that the party games of the Labor Party during the Gillard-Rudd period stunted the movement somewhat?
I think they probably did. I can't think of an example, but I know that in the Labor Party there has been a long tradition of objecting to marriage equality, or even to civil unions. There's always been an energy in all the major parties, the two major parties, against full LGBTI equality, but it's always very difficult to see. And what I mean by that is that the current situation that we have at any given time it's very difficult to actually flush out politicians' standpoint on this. And certainly 10 years ago when it was starting to unfold, it was almost impossible to see where people stood. You only really get to see it when there's a vote in Parliament on the floor, or there's legislation before the Senate. So in 2004, we saw both sides of Parliament, led by Mark Latham on the Labor side in opposition, and John Howard on the Liberal side. They all voted down marriage equality in that year. And every vote that we've had since then, it's been a matter of gauging where different politicians stand. And as we see, they evolve, they change their minds, they do U-turns. But when the big leadership position, or the party leaders or the current Prime Minister changes their mind, as Kevin Rudd did so famously in 2010, after 2010, in 2012 he changed his mind. And so when those changes of mind happen, it actually has a very big effect across the whole political spectrum. So the more of those, the better. Those are the things that really make a difference. And there's not been a country in the world, as far as I know, where marriage equality has passed if the current leader also doesn't support it.
Now, matters were further complicated by the fact that Jono's father had passed away about 6 weeks before he did, and that the probate hadn't been issued on his father's estate yet. And essentially, in sort of a condensed way, he was to inherit a third of that estate, which upon his passing would then likely have been conferred to you. Yeah. Do you think that drove the family to do what they did?
I think that was a key motivator, yes, it was. But as I say in the book, because I think a lot of people would interpret the issues that these particular blood relatives had with me as being all wrapped up in the processes of inheriting money or property. And I realised very soon after Jono died that this was something that would be a red flag. And I certainly wasn't putting myself in a position to try to inherit a third share of Jono's father's estate. Life delivers us what it delivers, and Jono was dead by the time probate was granted. And I hasten to add that had I been able to undo that probate, it would have been an historic event in New South Wales legal history, because undoing a granted probate is an incredibly huge process, and it would have been one of very few occasions in history when it had happened. So I thought that would ameliorate the problem a bit. It would actually soften the views of these family members towards me, but they never fully embraced that, which ultimately told me that it wasn't about money for them. It was something else, something in the more homophobic realm.
Yeah, and that's where you say that initially you thought that it was motivated by money, but then in the end I think you called it garden variety homophobia.
That's right. Yes, it's always very boring. It's boring when you read about it happening to other people. When it happens to you, or when it happened to me, you despair. I despaired. I just rolled my eyes. I thought, I just can't believe it. I can't believe it.
Now, Jono's co-writer on his last work was with him when he collapsed, and she rang you later to ask on behalf of someone who'd given him mouth-to-mouth if he was healthy, and did he have that certain disease to do with blood?
Yes.
Were you surprised that even in 2004 people were still hesitant to ask and to talk openly about HIV?
Yes, I was, and I was particularly surprised about that because the people that were asking were in the show business community, which since the year dot with the AIDS epidemic have been deeply affected by the consequences of death and incapacitation and all of the recovery processes for people who have been through and survived, and their friends, their families, their partners. So yes, it felt a little bit funny, but I thought about it afterwards and I thought, well, we probably should know better. Recently, as a week ago, there was a television broadcast about the story of Peter Allen and revelations about his coming out process, and I write about him in the book a little bit as a bit of a role model for young Australian gay men, particularly performers, and Jono was a young Australian gay performer. And there's very, very strange rules that are applied to them. And seeing the Peter Allen story was a big reminder about that. There's a lot that needs to change for people in those communities, and it's going to take a while, I think. So we'll watch and see.
Now, one of the most powerful sentences in the book, in my opinion, is that you said that a grieving mother gets a blank check, but a grieving gay spouse has limits imposed. Was it that sort of attitude that you think is why you saw so many institutions making life difficult for you, or going with the family's story over yours?
Yes, you've hit the nail on the head. It was reading and registering those feelings or open statements from people who were saying, but this is his mother. And all I wanted to say, well, I was his partner. And, you know, I often also add to those thoughts this idea that grief is not a competition. And as I explain in the book, I was acutely aware of the impact of the death of a child on a family, because it had happened in my family. And that really helped me be wise about making choices about what I did and how I conducted myself with Jono's mother, particularly, and his brother. And it was very, very difficult to see the lack of control I had about the way that people perceived what I was doing. Like, people were saying, it's terrible what you're doing to Jono's mother, it's terrible what you're putting his family through. And you know, they were the ones that instigated the litigation. They were the ones that made certain choices around what they had done. So it unfortunately did become a terrible competition, and people picked sides, as we're so good at doing in Australia. And I found myself on the losing side of a lot of those, and it was very, very hurtful, I have to say. When I cast my mind back and remember, that was a very, very difficult period, and the only thing I felt I could do was to sort of really hide myself away, because I was grieving. And in the end, that's what I did. And it was only when I really hid away from all of that energy and just stopped engaging with it that I was able to grieve for Jono properly.
Now, without giving away how things have ended up in the book, your counsellor that you had throughout the process eventually told you to stop fighting the legal battle.
Yeah.
And for a time you did, and you decided to stop that process. How do you stop doing something like that has consumed you basically since the first meeting in the funeral home?
I think this is one of the most important questions in the book, and it's the one that I would try to encourage people to explore by reading it, because it is probably one of the most difficult moments I had in my life, was to stay my hand and to encourage those around me to. Because when you're in litigation, you're fighting, it's a battle. One side says they're right, the other side says, no, you're not right, you're wrong. And things just escalated very, very quickly. And my counsellor didn't necessarily tell me to stop fighting, but he put me in a position, thank goodness, to allow that knowledge to hit me, that it was a possible choice that I could actually stop. And it took me properly about 3 months to fully come to terms with that. And he did it in a very simple way. Counsellors generally listen. They listen, they listen. And for many months I was able to sort of rail at the whole situation and enter into the rage and the injustice of it all. But at one crucial point my counsellor stopped listening, and he just very gently intervened and started to talk to me, to give me other options, other ways of thinking. And I took those away, and it was very, very difficult. But the thing I often talk about that really helped me was visualising. I'm very much a person that deals with words. But I had a very strong image at the time which helped me, and that was I literally just sort of took the boxing gloves off of this fight I was in, threw them down on the mat, got out through the ropes, walked through the crowd that were all, you know, egging us all on, and left the building completely. And I didn't necessarily tell the people I was fighting that. I left that for them to work out, and I haven't engaged with that energy in the many, many years since. And it was one of the best decisions of my life. But I do know, and I explore this in the book, I do know that for my counsellor, from his perspective, it must have seemed very on a knife edge. It could have gone either way, and it would have probably been very difficult to, it's the courage of counsellors, I think, very difficult to put people in those situations that are in grief and to encourage them to find a choice which is actually going to be ultimately incredibly beneficial. And it was finding that point in the book that ultimately I think was very healthy for me in the whole process of writing it, was to revisit that and re-inhabit it in a way, but also to share that message with other people.
Now to finish off, I was hoping that you could read a short extract from the book.
Sure.
If that's okay. This was probably one of the bits that really stood out for me, just that bit.
Sure, this is a mystery. What have we got? Okay, let me find where we are. Okay, so this is in the last third of the book, and I'm recounting a dream. Soon after, I dreamed of Jono again. I was home at Piedmont, a house he and I had never shared, on a sunny day that sent shafts of light through the front window, and Jono let himself in. We greeted one another. I was desperate to kiss him and hold him, but all he wanted to do was go upstairs and unpack his things in the bedroom, my bedroom, where we'd never slept together, and the only piece of his clothing was that one shirt I'd kept from the dirty clothes basket. He started to explain where he'd been, stuck in transit. I accepted his story without rancour, and as he piled his clothes back with mine on the shelves, and I lay on the bed, overjoyed to see him, I said to him in a strong, clear, low voice, "Okay, I have something to tell you about your family." He stopped piling his clothes onto mine and started to turn to me, but before I could see his face and interpret the still, pained angle of his shoulders, I woke up.
Michael Burge, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, pleasure.
Thank you. This was an interview for theheadlineact.com. You can see more information and links to Michael's work on the website or at burgewords.com. The latest book, Questionable Deeds, is available on Michael's website, on Booktopia or on Amazon as ebook and paperback. I'm Daniel Seed. Thanks so much for watching.